Welcome everyone to the first of hopefully many collaborations I will do on this channel. This one is very special because I was afforded the opportunity to work in Columbia City, which is a masterful build by Prez based off of Seattle and other Pacific Northwest cities. He put a call out in episode 33 or 34 of Columbia City with there was a Q&A and somebody asked a question about it. And he said for smaller YouTubers to hit him up, and so I sent him a message and now here we are. I assume most of my initial viewers from this video are coming from the video that I am featured in on his channel. So I just wanted to say welcome, and I hope you enjoy the content I've been creating. I love doing it, and I hope I will be able to continue to do it. My primary series is called Dragon's Gate, which is the story of a region that was once under British colonial rule until about the 70s. And after that, it was released and there was a bloody civil war ending with the region being split. The southern side, which will be heavily based off of Singapore, it remained totally independent, while the northern side eventually, later on in the late 80s, became a part of China and was given special status as a special economic zone, and so it is heavily based off of the city of Shenzhen. I hope you will check out that series and consider subscribing and helping this channel grow. I would love to have the opportunity to create another great community like many of the other content creators around this game, because I have met some of the most amazing people through those communities. This build was crazy fun, and it was a definite change of pace from what I've been doing in Dragon's Gate. It's good to work in a style you're much more familiar with, in my case being an American style. The workflow was much more streamlined because I didn't have to do nearly as much research on urban planning for an American city as I do for Asian cities. And some of this I based on my own experiences here in America, which is just awesome. Anyways, there's a lot of other stuff to go over with this whole thing, so let's just get into it. So when I first got the save, I had a lot of trouble opening it. I ended up having to load it using the loading screen mod's safe mode option, and after that it worked just fine. That's nothing to do with Prez, it's just wonkiness with the game. And I want to give a shout out to Alistrea from Cities Skylines Creators Discord. Probably pronounced your name wrong, sorry, but you were a ton of help in diagnosing the various issues that were causing crashes, so if you're watching, thanks a lot and I appreciate it. Anyways, once I got into the city, I bounced more than a few ideas off of Prez before I asked him how married he was to the football stadium on the south side. He said essentially not at all, so I deleted everything he did except the roads and just let my inspiration take over. In the episode where Prez built this part of the city, there was a ton of talk about how Columbia City hosts the Olympics in the past, and so I wanted to take that idea and run with it. I imagine the Olympics were here at least a couple of decades ago, and since then the area has been revitalized and rebuilt quite a lot. In fact, neither of the stadiums I placed down were, in my own story of it, neither of them existed at the time. This first stadium I placed is the Videotron Center, and it was made by Lumino on the workshop. Again, I'm pronouncing your name wrong, I get it, sorry. Anyways. At the time I subscribed to it, it was a brand new asset on the workshop, and I had just spent hours and hours and hours on the workshop just trying to find a good asset to place here. I really wanted to place a baseball stadium, but there's just very, very few quality stadium assets on the workshop, and the ones that are high quality just do not fit this area. That's something we're very much missing on the workshop, high quality stadiums, or at least we have very few of them. I would create one myself, but I just don't have the time to dedicate to asset creation. But like I said, this Videotron Center, it works just fine, and I suppose basketball is a bigger sport in Columbia City than baseball. Something else that had just been released on the workshop was these North American railway networks, and it's something that both Prez and I wanted to include in the city. In his original build, there was this area with some abandoned rails, and that's something I wanted to duplicate and detail it up a bit more. This area before the Olympics, from what I understand, was just a ton of industry and all of that, so I definitely wanted to include a little bit of that legacy. For this little stretch right here, I took a ton of inspiration from Occidental Avenue in Seattle next to CenturyLink Field. It's just a row of old warehouses converted into mostly stadium district commercial storefronts. The toughest part of this was that the lots between the abandoned tracks and the road were actually really compact, so there were a few buildings that I wanted to use, but I wasn't able to use them because they were just too big. But I did find a series of buildings that fit the style I wanted, and this little block actually ended up being one of my favorite parts of the build. The next thing I do is I start putting pedestrian pathways around the arena. This ended up being a little bit easier said than done because the terrain in this area of the city is most definitely not flat. It was also kind of weird to do just because of the shape of the building, and it has all these various asymmetrical sections around the actual round arena. After that, I placed a parking garage kind of like in the corner, and then I get to work on this back area that has a bunch of loading docks and such. I based this area a bit off of the Georgia World Congress Center, which used to be connected to the Georgia Dome, but now it's across the plaza from the brand new Mercedes-Benz Stadium. When I was in college marching band, our football team played in the Georgia Dome a couple of times, and we would enter the dome via the back way through the World Congress Center, like the logistics area, and so I took a lot of inspiration from what I experienced there. In the game, I used a series of these distribution center buildings that have loading docks along one side and plopped a couple down so that they connected to the arena. And in there, I just put some trucks with some trailers and some parked cars and a few other little random props, and I added some stain decals to make the concrete feel quite used. After that, I start getting into a little bit of detail, adding a few trees in key areas. Right now, I use a lot of these juniper trees, but as we go forward, things get a bit more diverse. Also, at this parking garage, I put a road going inside it to add a little bit more of a realistic look, and that's something that I will do with all the other various parking garages that I'll plop down later on. Then I move on to this main entry area to the arena. I start out just by placing a few of these shared pedestrian roads to just kind of get the layout I want. And then I start placing a couple of buildings like this stage I end up replacing and various mixed use buildings, and I used mixed use loosely because I'm sure these wouldn't necessarily have any residents. They're just mostly for commercial and event purposes. It was just a matter of finding the right style of buildings that fit and that I could also clip together to fill the area so that it didn't look bad. I really wanted this area to feel like a modern stadium district with all kinds of restaurants and shops and whatever else you would find in these areas. And then for the main entrance, I used a bunch of these door props, and I put a fairly large glass awning above the entrance. And then in front of it, I put this big brick gateway thing out front just to tie it all together. Then I moved back to this other block of buildings and placed a parking garage and surrounded it with more of these dense commercial buildings to make it look as if it was one single structure. And then I just go back around and place a bunch of different signs and advertisements around the area for all the different shops and stalls and restaurants and such. And I had various props for kiosks and all that, and some planters with trees just to finish it all up. The next block we moved to, I imagined, is the former site of the original Olympic Stadium. It's now been converted into a more mixed-use commercial area with an Olympic plaza in the center. I start out by placing this building that has this archway on it that it's kind of the entrance to the plaza coming from where the new arena sits. But when I go and place the roads, I find out that it's not exactly center on the block, so I end up having to work around some asymmetry. But after I have the roads down, I start covering the area of the plaza with these vanilla zoo decals from the Park Life DLC, and these have quickly become one of my favorite decals. They're really nice. In the center of the plaza, I put this Olympic logo statue thing. I'm not really sure what you're supposed to call it, but I end up moving it around a lot in this sequence, so don't be surprised to see it in like weird different places coming up. Then I go around and start filling out these buildings. I use all the same style of modern mixed-use buildings that I used previously, and they're all from the same pack. I just take the time to fit them in and make it look good. I started out by placing all the quarter buildings first and then filling in the gaps. I use this archway building again as an entrance to the parking garages that are supposed to be hidden in the center of the blocks. I have to use 3 or 4 garages for each block because all the others I had were way too large, but fitting 4 of these together ends up looking pretty good. And again, I give these parking garages road access by dragging a road through the archway, similar to how I did it for the first parking garage. After getting all the buildings in place, I got to detailing again with more signs and such, and I added several sets of tables for restaurants and just more planters with trees. But my favorite detail is I took these gantry networks and I span them across from one building to another, and in the center of it I put an Olympic logo on them. I had to use procedural objects to get rid of the legs because on the prop version the logo was suspended on top of a couple of poles. It ended up looking way better than I had originally expected, and it looks great with the snow-capped mountain in the background. Once I had all of that completed, I moved on to the next block, or actually in this case it's a triangle. The idea for this area would be to start transitioning it back to the old legacy industrial areas that were there previously. And I used the same style of buildings as I used in that first little stretch of older buildings from the beginning of the episode, but instead of it being compacted against an old abandoned lot of railway tracks, it's backed up against an active monorail. And I made the roads, and it divided this area into 3 smaller blocks. 2 of them are triangles and 1 is a more square block. The square block has an alley in the middle that leads to yet another parking garage, and then in one of the triangle blocks I put a set of kind of run down industrial shops, maybe like some sort of mechanic shops or something, and I divided those lots with a fence and added some scrap cars and some of those dark dirt decals and a few other details. And on the last little triangle block I just put a larger loft building and a few smaller buildings with a parking area behind them. Then the next thing I do is I start working on this football stadium. I kind of imagine this stadium was built on the former site of the Olympic Village where all the athletes would stay during the games. And it would make sense to have an original monorail stop there, and instead of moving the monorail stop, I imagine they just replaced the abandoned village with a new stadium a few years after the games. This stadium block I wasn't entirely sure how to approach, so when I started it, I started by making some pedestrian paths around it. But then I got around to this open end of the stadium and I decided to make it to be under renovation or maybe even some sort of expansion. Obviously, as a construction area, I put a fence around it, and then I start placing all kinds of these various construction props. Things like cranes and front end loaders and bulldozers, and I place a few storage containers and some pipes around, and a couple of these small portable offices for, I guess, the construction administrators or whatever. And off to the side, I obviously have to place some porta potties, and then I just finish up this area with various dirt and mud decals. Then, in this corner where the monorail cuts over to go to the station, I decorate with some of these trees and make it look nice and landscaped. I use these eastern red cedar trees that look amazing and just various colorful bushes. And on these series of blocks, there was a slight elevation difference that I had to deal with. So for the stadium, I decided to put up a retaining wall down the length of it and place some ploppable grass over the top of it where there's a gap between the actual wall and the terrain. And at the base of that wall, I placed some large bushes, and then I go around and start placing more bushes around the paths. On the sides of the paths, I use these small regular bushes, and then I place some spaced out juniper trees. And then that created some empty grassy areas, so I placed a couple more of these eastern red cedar trees in a few of them, and it just turned out looking really good. After that, I just placed some decals at the entrance to the stadium. Again, I used those zoo brick decals that I love, and a series of other tile decals leading up the pathway to the stadium. And back along the roads, I continued that line of large bushes that I placed next to the retaining wall, and I just ended up using them to line all the roads next to the stadium just to finish out the block. On these last two blocks on this side, I work on a series of new residential apartment complexes. Again, it was a little bit of a challenge to fit everything in now that part of the block also has to deal with this height difference from the road below. But I started by placing a couple of roads and experimenting with the layout for them a bit. I think I try 3 or 4 different layouts and different kinds of buildings before I settle on the final design, which is just a parking lot road and these 3 apartment buildings. And once I have those down, I want to put in a little bit of kind of some amenities for the residents. So I move one of the roads so I can fit in this pool building. And I'm not sure if this pool building, if it's vanilla or if it's part of something from the workshop, but after messing with it for a bit, I got it to fit and it looks quite nice actually. Then I surround the property with a fence and start adding some foliage. I try to make things look nice and like they're landscaped. So I use these large bushes and I put them down in rows, and then I mix in a couple of other tall trees, and then I do the same little technique on the small cliff face. And along the sidewalks, I placed some more of these columnar trees that I used previously, as well as some other large trees in the grassy areas. I'm not entirely sure what these large trees are because I just kind of use Move It to copy them from another part of the city, just so that I stayed kind of uniform and I didn't want to use some weird random tree that didn't fit the style of the rest of the city. Then moving on to the last block on this side, I first put back the trolley bus depot that I deleted at the very beginning, and that set up the space for the second set of apartments. And again, I used a parking lot road and placed down some buildings of a similar modern design. And between those buildings, I actually take the paths and have them lead down to the main road. And instead of a pool, this complex gets a series of basketball and tennis courts. Again, I surround the property with a fence and follow the same pattern of foliage from the previous complex. And in between the apartments and the trolley bus depot, I make sure to add a couple of extra trees just to serve as a sort of sound barrier. So with all of that complete, there's only this one block to go, and we start here at this light rail depot. It's another thing that I had deleted at the beginning, but I decided to keep it where it was. So I plopped it back down and connected back the rails, and actually I added this extra siding between the building and the road. I'm not entirely sure how realistic this is. I'm not really a train guy, I'm more of an airplane guy, but anyways, I surround the facility with a fence and start placing down some storage tanks. And I also place down some containers and some maintenance trucks and a load of signs and stuff like that for when they're working on the rails that are over the roads. And also place down some rail props. I assume these would be sets of rails they recently replaced, and so they were kind of just left outside temporarily until they would be able to be transported to be scrapped. And then I moved on and placed down some of these warehouses and a few more industrial shops, and actually placed down this one fairly large old factory building. And then I go and I fence off the huge lot with all the abandoned railroad tracks. And actually on the train track lots, I start placing all kinds of tall grass and overgrown bushes and such, because this area, it never really gets cleaned up and it's just kind of been sitting there for forever. And along with that, I cover it with more of these dirt and mud decals to give it a much more realistic look than the base gravel from the theme I'm using. And by the way, I'm actually using the SCT Homecoming theme in this build. I think it's either that or Nature Reserve. I'll have to double check. But anyways, after I get done with the abandoned rails, I move back over to these warehouses and start adding bits of detail there. And this was oddly challenging because for a while, no matter what I placed, it just seemed to still be empty. But I start off with all these dirt and stain decals, and in this first little open area, I put some trucks and some storage tanks and a forklift and all kinds of stuff like that. And then in the next open area, I kind of make it like a storage area for a concrete company with a bunch of concrete trucks. And then after placing a couple of parking lots and a couple of trees, the last thing I did for this entire build was I went back over the entire thing and added lights in places that needed it, so this place would look really great at night. And everyone, if you made it this far into the video, first of all, thank you for watching. Second, I'll just ask you again to like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it. And leave a comment because I love engaging with my viewers. As I said in the beginning, I love doing this build, and I can definitely see how this city and this style is something Perez enjoys doing. All of the other collaborators in Columbia City have also done some amazing builds, and a lot of them are really hard to top. The talent in this community is crazy, and I genuinely hope to continue to see more amazing content from everyone. Once again, I would like to thank Perez for the opportunity to do this build. It was awesome. My next video on this channel will probably be another collab video with someone else, but otherwise, stay on the lookout for more Dragon's Gate. But for now, I hope to see you in the next one.